So, if you're watching the previous video, I didn't mean to hit stop, and I apologize, I meant to hit pause, but those buttons are right next to each other, so this is what happens. What I'm trying to kind of put across as a point here is the difference between opening this up as a website and opening it up as a project. So when I went and opened it up from my file folder, I actually went into my Google Drive, found the right folder, and I'm very proud of myself because I have it all organized, right? And I found my solution file, and I double-clicked it, and it opened up. But when it opens up as a project with the folder that actually holds the website, which is this one, as subordinate to the project. So when I go to launch it, it's looking one level higher to try to run this thing. But this is not a compiled program, folks. It's a website. So the trick really is, when you go to open this up, you really should be doing open website and then choose the folder, the web calculator folder, or in other words, this folder, and then open the project. Now, you should probably think to yourself, what's the difference, right? Because we're in the same spot. The difference is how Visual Studio handles it and how it pushes it out to the web server. One approach, the web server won't run it. The other approach, it will. So yours worked just fine? Okay, well, maybe you did a better job of saving yours. So I'll tell you what, if your solution file is causing you problems, one thing you can do is, you know what? You just delete it. Right? And it'll just create another one when you go to do a save all, and it'll ask you. Now, when it asks you to create a solution file, folks, you can say cancel. That's kind of interesting, right? It's kind of like the old Windows security screens, right? Like you would log into Windows. Okay, enter password, right? And then you had two options, OK or cancel. And if you would hit cancel, you still got into Windows. I know, that's ridiculous, right? But in the old days, Windows was not very secure. All right, folks, so hopefully that makes sense. And maybe I should just demonstrate that really quick just for clarity's sake. So I'm going to close the project down. And then, so in other words, choose open, don't choose project or solution, choose website, and then don't choose this level, choose the actual folder that contains all the files. And then the web server should operate correctly. All right. Okay, that was step number 2. Got to have a little fun with it. All right, so let's go ahead on to step number 3 now, and it says in the Solution Explorer, copy the default HTML page to a new HTML file by right-clicking and choosing copy. So let's do that. If you guys weren't aware that you can do that, you sure can. And then go ahead and choose paste. Oop, we got to do it here though. Got to right click on the root. So if you're not getting paste, that's because you're clicking in an open space. You have to click on the root. All right, click paste, and then you can see it names it as copy. And we do want to right click and rename that, and they want us to call it contactus.html. All right, that completes step number 5. We're on to page 332. All right, now under the next set of instructions, it says open up this file and delete the div ID calculator element and its contents. So one simple way that you guys can do that, like you guys notice how it starts here, but who knows where it ends? Actually, it ends way down there. You guys, I'm hoping are aware of how to use these little boxes off to the side, right? Little collapse boxes. You can actually collapse the whole thing and then just delete the whole thing. Did that get rid of everything? It didn't. But if you do this and highlight it all, that does. So that's what they want you to do. Or if you want, you could manually highlight the whole thing and delete it, whatever works for you. But the reason they put these little tools in here is to make your life easier, folks. So learn how to leverage them, right? Maybe you guys are intuitive and understand that already. All right, so once you have that removed, you should still have the div for main. They want us to come up to the title element here, so I'm on step number 7 right now, and they want us to change that to contact us, which makes sense. Then inside, apparently I didn't delete it. Let's delete it. Inside the div with the role of main, they want us to create a new div, so go ahead and do that. And they want us to set its ID to contact us. Kind of like that. Inside this div, they want us to add a form. So go ahead and put the opening and closing tags in there. And then they want us to set the name of the form to contact form. They also want you to set the method to get. Is get default or is post default? Get is default. One thing that's real critical about forms, folks, is when you do a get, whatever is embedded in that form is sent in clear text in the URL when you hit that submit button. If you don't want the stuff to be in clear text, you use post. All right, step number 10. It says add a div element containing a label and an input of type text, and do the same thing for last name, first name, last name, email address, and message. And if you have access to the PDF version of the book, you can do this really quickly by just copy pasting, which is what I'm going to do. And it should look something like this. So what they're doing is they're taking each form element and they're putting it inside of a container, in this case a div. And then each input that we're creating, and notice the pattern here, and these are things that you should have learned, but I'm going to reiterate them just in case you didn't learn them the first time. Notice that we do have to have a type for the input. So when it says type text, that means a box that you type into, right? So text box. We give it a name and we give it an ID. Why do we give it both? Right. If you want to script to it. That's exactly correct. So JavaScript, in some circumstances, actually prefers that you use the name as opposed to the ID. So we give it both as a matter of good practice. I'm actually really surprised that they didn't put ID on the form. But, it doesn't matter. But you do notice that they do have a name, because that way they can act upon it with JavaScript a little bit more elegantly. That's kind of a little bit of a legacy thing, frankly, because in most circumstances when you work in HTML documents, you would tend to prefer to use IDs and classes to refer to objects in JavaScript, but with form elements, for whatever reason, name has stuck, and that's because of all the different complexities of working with forms. So the rule of thumb that I tell people is always add an ID and always add a name, and ideally they should be the same. Okay? Just a rule of thumb. They're also including a label, and that's a special tag, but notice that it's got this special attribute of for, which indicates which of the inputs it's attached to. And that is really kind of an encapsulation thing of sorts to basically associate them together. So we did that for first name, last name, email, and message. All of them are text inputs. All of them have the same basic attributes. And then finally, they do also want us to add a submit button. And notice button of type submit. Is there a different way to do that? There actually is. You can also actually say, yeah, you can just do input type submit and it turns it into a button as well. Is one better than the other? I see a lot more people these days switching over to the button approach because it just makes more sense. And buttons have a special little capability that you can actually, and we talked about this already, that you can take a button and you can pull it out of a form and use it as a button even though it's not inside of a form. So that's a little bit of a difference. All right. Notice that also has an ID and name of submit. All right. Why don't we go ahead and hit the save icon there, save our work so we don't lose it. And now we're going to go over to the CSS file. So we're going to open up the default CSS. And they want us to make a little bit of an adjustment here. And they're saying at the very bottom that we should add a style for label. So I'm just going all the way to the bottom because that's what they're doing. And just paste in these styles right here. All right, on step number 12, bottom of page 333, top of 334. Now we're going to add some styles for form input. And in my book, this is split over 2 pages, so it's going to be 2 pastes into the document. So the first part is the selector, and the first style, and the second part is the rest of it. So now, remember, as CSS selectors go here, this is obviously going to apply to any input that's inside the form tag. Doesn't matter what kind it is. No. So we're giving it a width, border color, height, a text alignment, vertical alignment, font, and a font size. I find it curious that they're using points for the font size. Not a practice I usually encourage unless you know you're going to print media, but I think they do that to kind of vary it up so you try different things. I also would rarely go to use HSL color, but they want you to work with that too. All right, adding another style now to the bottom. So we're on step 13, and this one is for the form button. And one thing I do want to talk about is I paste this in because I look at this and right away, to me, it screams a bunch of stuff, right? So as a coder, when I'm coding, I'm always trying to find efficient ways to do the code. Go to Kleenex, but no go. And what I see here is similarities between the two. Do you guys notice that there's some similarities between these two styles? When I see that the border width, the border color, you know, the font family, all that stuff's the same. Those could be combined into one style shared with both things, right? All right, so not a big deal for a little application like this, but if you were writing, like, you know, something that had like 10,000 lines of CSS, sounds outrageous, but that's not really that unusual. You would look for efficiencies to not repeat code. If you could cut those lines down, you would try to combine them. So I'm just mentioning that just for the sake of it. All right, and then it says in step number 13, which is an easy directive to miss here, it says the last thing you must do is add a hyperlink on the main page that references the contact us HTML file. So the question then becomes, where? Where do you think? Oh yeah, that's not the default page. All right, this is the default page here. And where do you think I should put it, maybe? Yeah, why not put it in the navigation, right? So let's just go ahead and type it in, or you want to be lazy, let's do that. And remember, it's not cheating. Now, I'm going to argue, if you're on the Contact Us page, don't you want to be able to go back to the home page too? Well, you can. Should we put a Contact Us link here? Yeah, you could. Well, I would argue that your navigation should be consistent. So my temptation, and I don't think the book tells us to do this, or maybe they do, is to add a link in there. And I'm noticing that what they're doing on the default page is they're also putting a line break in here, like that. So you should do the same thing. And then since you're doing it there, you may as well do it here. Did not want it that far over, but that's easily fixable. All right, everybody good? Piece of cake? All right, let's go ahead and launch this. All right, so it launched, looks just fine. Now they do want us, oh no, it doesn't look just fine. What's missing? Yeah, little control F5 there. And now we have the Contact Us link here. So we want to go to the form, and we have a rudimentary form here, very plain looking. Some styles, nothing too fancy, but it seems to be working. Now, the thing that they want you to do is, type in something. Now, granted, we have no validation yet, so keep that in mind. And then hit submit. And then when you hit submit, take note of the fact that you've just generated basically a query string that is embedded in the URL in the form of a GET. So when your method is GET, you see all the stuff in there. And step number 16 on page 334 shows you this exactly. So if you look at it really carefully, the first indicator here is the fact that you have a question mark right there where I'm highlighting right now. So prior to that question mark is the page that you were on where you hit the submit button. The question mark and the things that follow in the format of a key value pair with the key being the name of whatever it is you're, okay, not what I wanted to do. The name of the input and then the value that you typed in. And each one of those key value pairs is separated with an ampersand. I always like to point this out to people. If you ever go to Google, like we just accidentally did, not so accidentally. Heck, even my search for Google yields a query string. You see that? Remember, GET leaves it as plain text. You guys should know that, and I'm sorry if I'm belittling it by saying it too many times, but sometimes it doesn't stick, and it's good to repeat it just so that you have it. All right, that in essence is the completion of the first exercise. Wow, that was easy, right? If only they were all that easy. No unit testing here, folks. None of that QUnit stuff. All right, so now we're going to close our browser here. Stop the web server from running. I would just confirm that you have everything saved. It should be saved if you just launch the web browser. All right. So now we're on to the next exercise here, which is at the bottom of 335. And step 2 says to open up the Contact Us, which is already open. And then we're going to go to the input for first name, which is this tag here. And we're going to add a required attribute to first name, last name, email, and message. All of them are going to have a required attribute. Now, without hopefully looking at the next page, how do I add a required attribute? Somebody tell me. Yeah, you can just say required, and believe it or not, that is enough. Or, what's another way I can do it? Yeah, required is equal to required. What genius thought of that, right? This is always one of my weird like HTML5 things. Shouldn't it be like required true or yes or maybe even only on odd numbered Tuesdays or something? So either one will work, and if you want to experiment with the two different approaches, just to confirm that they are actually working things. My preference usually is when I'm coding, I just go with required because that's enough. Now, here's my 2 cents worth on this. When I first worked with forms, and JavaScript was kind of a new technology back then, and the way that we would validate things on forms is we would write JavaScript. And one of the first ones you would learn is how to check to see if something was left blank. That was like your first one, right? Because if you required a person's name, how do you check it? So what they did is in HTML5, and they actually added it before HTML5 was out, they just built in that capability. It does happen with JavaScript on the back end. It's still the tool that's doing the work, but now it's built into the standard. So we would spend a lot of time when you were learning how to do JavaScript teaching people how to do validation. That validation approach is still very valid, and that's important to understand, that some things are better checked with JavaScript than they are using the HTML5 built-in validation tools. But a lot of stuff that we used to write JavaScript for is now built into HTML5. So you know what that does is it really lightens the load quite a bit on the code that we need to write and also the work that the browser does, because now it doesn't need to process this JavaScript, it just does it internally, right? Now, why do you validate stuff on a form anyhow?
We want good data. Good data.
Right, because we need to have good data. Maybe not on the website, but usually what happens, on most dynamic websites, when you hit that submit button and you fill out a form, where does that data go? A database. Now, any of you that have worked with databases, you guys all should have at this point, right? And if you haven't taken the database class yet, please do. I can argue that's one of your more important classes. But a database is structured to receive certain types of information in their tables and columns and the fields that you create, right? And in fact, some of those requirements are pretty strict. Like you might have fields that will accept text, but they might have a limit as to how much. Or you might have fields that accept numbers, but certain types, whether it's an integer or a floating point number, right? Or, you can come up with a bunch of different scenarios, characters, all sorts of stuff. But the point is, one of the reasons we do validation on the client, in other words, in the web browser, is so that we can sanitize the data being sent to the database so that it goes in cleanly and does not make the database misbehave. Or worse yet, you send data to the database and then the database sends back an error message about some SQL statement being incorrectly phrased that the user doesn't care about or even wants to know about, right? You don't want to give back, like, MySQL database says user does not exist. I'm just trying to buy this product on Amazon, right? That's not what you want to see. You just want it to work. So the reason we validate is to make sure good data goes into our database and that our applications work correctly. So on a well-formed application, you will often see 2 or 3 layers of validation that happens when the data goes in through an application. So you'll have stuff that happens in the browser, and we can use our HTML5 to do some rudimentary validation. It's actually pretty sophisticated these days, honestly. We can also use JavaScript in the client to help with the process. We can also write server-side scripts, whether it's ASP.NET or PHP or Java or whatever, that also validate all of them before the information gets to the database. The last thing you want is the database going, I don't know what to do with this. That's not acceptable in terms of applications. The last thing you want is a database error coming back at your user. So that's kind of the rationale there. And I think it's a pretty important thing conceptually to understand. And some people will say, well, like having all those layers of validation is silly. Not really, right? Because a user can turn off validation in their browser by doing what? Turning off JavaScript. So if you write JavaScript validation and JavaScript is turned off, it's not going to validate. So that's why a lot of times programmers will prefer server-side validation, because it eliminates that need. Isn't that interesting? Because they can't control what happens on the server side, but users can control what happens in their browser. Not too many people turn off JavaScript these days. In the old days, there was a whole camp of people that are paranoid about things, like people are paranoid about like pop-ups and malware and stuff these days, and they would just turn off images too, and it's like, what's the point? No images, no JavaScript, what's the point of being on the web, really?
Yeah.
So, all right, folks. Are you guys good? Everybody's got the required things in there. Step number 4, 335. And they want us to replace the type attribute on the email field with email. Because guess what? That is a type now. And what that does is it enforces what we call a regular expression. You guys learned about regular expressions in the chapter 2? All right. Well, if you didn't, I am compelled to bring a browser onto the screen here and just type in regular expression. And yeah, sure, Wikipedia is fine. And what I'm looking for is just kind of like this weird little syntax. And believe it or not, this syntax, as cryptic as it is a universal syntax across just about every programming language I can think of. In fact, there's a book, you can go to Barnes & Noble and buy a book like 3 inches thick just on regular expressions. Oh my God, I don't know why you would go to that trouble, but they're out there, right? Somebody must be the regular expression guru or something. But that format, and if you want to study it, please feel free. If you were going to take the certification exam that matches this book, you would need to do a little bit of brush up on regular expressions in order to pass, because they usually throw like 2-3 questions at you out of like 60 or 70 questions that are based on regular expressions. So you don't want to fail as a result of that. But what this language does is it basically sets a pattern for what the information should be that goes into the input field. When we switch the type inside of our tag here to email, it automatically looks for some string of text, an @ sign, another string of text, a period, and at least 2 characters. Because that, at a minimum, is what is required to form an email address. It doesn't care what the characters actually are. And these days, it's kind of important to remember that URLs don't have to be .com or .gov or .edu or .biz or .us. They can be anything. If you guys aren't aware of that, that's a pretty important thing. You can actually go to some registrars and you can get a URL that is whatever you want it to be. As long as you're willing to pay the money to do it, they're willing to create it for you. So no longer are we limited to .coms. And one thing I would also ask you guys to think about when you're like getting website names is breaking the paradigm of thinking that you must have .com. And it's a real hard sell even to professionals, but it's even a harder sell to clients. But I see people that now are finally starting to catch on to it. And like the one site like my students did a number of years ago, you guys may have seen this one before, I'm sure, is this one. We did a site for a place up in Mequon called On the Way Cafe, and you notice their URL? Because they wanted to get onthewaycafe.com, right? But that wasn't available. Somebody already took it. So they got ontheway.cafe. Pretty cool, right? So change your mindset on that and open up to it. But putting this in here in essence, is really triggering background validation and regular expressions. It's just handled internally. We don't have to code it. How beautiful is that? I think it's a wonderful thing. Because it actually works pretty darn well. All right. They want us to also change the message to a text area. So instead of using an input here, they want you to change it to a text area. Now, a text area is different than an input because an input is a self-closing tag, right? A text area is not. It requires a separate closing tag. So then the question always becomes is what do you put here in between? Whatever. Yeah, a placeholder. That's essentially correct. You don't have to put anything in there, or you could really say, add a comment or add your message here, something like that. Now, the book is not asking us to do that, but if you wanted to, you could. No harm done. All right, now we're going to go back to our style sheet here, and now we're going to add a style for the text area. So just add that right to the bottom. Now you guys see how simple our website is? We're already up to, we're pushing 200 lines of CSS already. They add up quick, especially if you're not efficient with it. All right, at this point we're ready to run the application, so go ahead and hit the play button and see what happened. What we're looking for is a change, not on the default page, but on the Contact Us page. And then if you want, hit the submit button without typing anything in. Right, it's going to trigger the internal validation. So please fill it out. Okay, filled it out. Then it goes to the next one. All right, do it again. Just type something in. Got to be an email address. So isn't that cool? Yes, there are other ways to do this with other scripting languages. That one's required too. Pretty simple little exercise, but important. And that really completes chapter 7. It's a really easy chapter, folks. It's kind of a repeat of stuff we learned in Web 1. There are some new things to learn in there, but I want you to keep in mind that HTML5 form elements is lots of new ones. And what I always like to do to demonstrate that is just do a simple search here. And then the reason I do this is I want you to be aware. I was, kind of hoping for that concise list. Here we go. Some of the form elements that are out there, and then how many of them also have some very unique attributes. So maybe my search could be better stated as HTML5 form attributes. Am I on the same page? No, here they are. All right. But just to get an idea. Now, these are attributes just for the form tag, but there's all sorts of them, and they all do different things. There's no way any class that you're going to take is going to have enough time to go through each one of these things, but I would encourage you guys to read up on them, because your chances are you do a project someday, and it would be really cool if, So you see things like autocomplete. There's an autocomplete? All right, so you might want to look that stuff up and figure out how to employ it. I know that most of you just want to get your score on the assignment and move on, but as you delve into this field professionally, you guys have to start putting it upon yourself to start exploring these little nooks and crannies on your own and try them. Or at least read up on it and be aware that it's there, and then you can figure out how to employ it later. Most of them are super easy to employ and don't take anything more than just setting the attribute correctly. So make sure you you do that. All right, I'm going to stop this video here. We're going to take a break in class, and we're going to come back and move on to the next chapter.